There are so many differences in the way the story is described, in pieces that are not there in the book of Mark that are there in Luke. So let me just point out a few of them to you, okay? Number one, I said this earlier, the Garden of Gethsemane is not named. So in Mark and Matthew, what happens is all the disciples go to the Mount of Olives, and then just 3 of them go with Jesus. So Peter, James, and John go with Jesus to the garden. The garden is named in those books Gethsemane. Whoever gave Luke this information doesn't remember the name or didn't think it was important. All he remembers is that it was on the Mount of Olives. Also, he doesn't say anything about just the 3 disciples going away with Jesus, although that clearly happened. He just talks about all the disciples going with him onto the mountain. Totally different opening. Okay? The other thing that happens here is the words. I mean, Jesus says in all the accounts, he says basically the same thing, but he says it in different words. So in Matthew and Mark, he says, watch and pray. And watching specifically meant stay awake late into the night. Stay awake, don't fall asleep. But that phrase isn't found here. It's a little bit different wording, though of course it means the same thing. Pray that you won't fall into temptation. The distance that he withdrew from them is described differently. These are small things, but once again, why is this important? It helps us realize that these are actual events that are being described by different people. It also helps us enter into it. Whoever gave this account of the story describes it as he went about a stone's distance away, about the distance you could throw a rock. It's described differently in Matthew and Mark. He went a little ways away. He prayed. The other big difference is in Matthew and Mark, there's sort of a cycle of 3 times. Many of you will know that, right? Where Jesus goes away and prays, and then he comes back and the disciples are sleeping. He wakes them up. Then he goes away and prays again, and then he comes back. It happens 3 times. And then finally, he's arrested at the end. But in Luke's version, there's really only one that's described. This doesn't mean that they're contradictory. Do you guys see that? I mean, it's just sort of left out here. Or maybe whoever he was interviewing didn't even remember that there were 3 times. I think this is an intriguing idea. Maybe whoever he's interviewing here didn't wake up the first 2 times. Who of the disciples, if you had to guess which of the disciples, especially of the 3 who were really with Jesus in the garden, Peter, James, and John, there's really only 3 choices. Who do you think is most likely to have not woken up the first 2 times? You could make lots of guesses about this, and we don't know the real answer. But I've noticed that teenagers are sometimes really hard to wake up. Have you ever noticed that? I've also noticed that only one of the disciples was still a teenager at this moment, and that was the disciple John, who we know from earlier. We've looked at this. It's almost certain that Luke at some point interviewed John. Very interesting. John doesn't wake up the first 2 times. Do you wake up the first time when Jesus is trying to get your attention?